This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
I think the average student at a college, university, or even, your nice woke Aunt Susan or your neighbor down the street, they are not steeped in Hegel. They don't consider themselves Marxists. And this is part of where the confusion lies, is that it's ostensibly a movement just for justice. And who doesn't want justice? It's a movement that wants to fight racism. Every good-willed, normal, reasonable person wants to fight racism. So there are all of these very, deeply actually Christian claims. Christians are supposed to be people of justice, supposed to be people who are fighting against injustice. And I think that the reality that most people would consider themselves Marxists but have adopted so many of the conclusions of this movement is just a sign of how pervasive and how ubiquitous the movement has become.
It's the Drew Mariani Show on Relevant Radio.
Yeah, that's my next guest, Noelle Mering. She's going to be stopping by in a second. We'll talk to her about it. I've spoken to her many times. She wrote a book on really the rise of wokeism in our culture today, and it's kind of frightening. I thought maybe we'd touch on that. I saw a couple stories. Let me share these with you, then we'll talk to Noelle a little bit about this. There's a surgeon, I should say, in Texas who's facing federal charges for allegedly exposing personal medical data of patients at Texas Children's Hospital who were undergoing so-called gender transitions. His name was Dr. Eitan Haim, and he is accused of snatching the information, sharing it with a conservative activist with the intent of causing malicious harm. He wanted to sully the hospital. He, of course, denies doing it. He says he acted as a whistleblower because the hospital publicly stated that they were no longer doing surgeries when, in fact, they were. Texas has since outlawed such procedures on minors, but the law is being contested in court. The city of Huntington Beach, California, is suing that state because of a new law that tells schools you can't tell parents that your children is dealing with gender dysphoria. The city believes that parents should know that and that they are suing the state to make sure they can do that. And the very fact, though, that a children's hospital is doing these surgeries is really an indictment of how woke the medical establishment has become. And a state that tells schools, you got to hide the information from parents, it means the same thing. But you know that it's not just the medical or the educational establishments that are doing this. The idea that people can change their genders, that parents have no rights to know what their children, what they're struggling with, especially when it comes to gender identity in schools, that sexual licentiousness is okay, that is actually good. That is a radical ideology. There are certain ongoing behaviors in our culture right now. Certain races are certain perpetual victims. There are others that are policies that are inherently racist. We're living in a time, I think, of great confusion. And the question is, how do you head it off in your own family? How do you do that? I don't know if you've noticed how wokeism has crept into almost every part of our society. And it's the workplace. As I said, it's the school, it's the hospital. There's a book out called Awake, Not Woke. It's not just a social movement. It's a cult of progressive ideology, written by Noelle Mering. She joins me today, and it's great to have her in studio with us. Noelle, thank you for what you've done. I saw those two stories earlier today, and I thought that's just very simple examples of what we're seeing. And as I was going through a lot of this stuff, I knew you were going to be stopping by. I was just wondering, where are we with it right now? Is it on the rise, or are people now beginning to see the bad fruit of this? And we saw what the one doctor did. Are people trying to call it out, step away from it? Are things changing?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on opposite ends of the spectrum. So I do think that over the last few years, as I talk to people about this movement, there's far more people now who are privy to what's actually happening and seeing it for what it is. And I think that is a great sign of hope and a natural course of things. The woke movement by nature always overreaches. It's always escalating. Mm-hmm. And so the manipulation grows and intensifies as it escalates, and people start to wake up to what's really happening. And so I think that that's an important thing to realize, is that though the escalation feels kind of scary, it's also at the time when people see it through it. Now, on the other hand, I think that there's a lot more of our young people who are swept up in it. Yeah. So that, the rising generation has really been seeped in it through everything you say, through their school environment, the school culture, the books, through their media, the technology. I mean, all of these things have kind of coalesced and converged to really try to radicalize them pretty young. And so I think that there's a lot of destabilizing in the rising generation. So I think that there's those two things are both happening. I think a lot of people are waking up to what's happening, and a lot of people are still getting pulled into it. So we still have a lot of work ahead of us.
To me, it's crazy. I mean, maybe we should do this too. I mean, I have your book. I've talked about this many, many times on the radio, but explain what wokeism is. I mean, it was a relatively new term, being woke. I remember when it first came out. What's woke? What's it mean to be woke? Now it's a part of our lexicon, right? It's part of our vernacular. It's infiltrated everything, as I point out. Explain what wokeism is, and is it a reincarnation of something that existed prior to that? And how did it get such traction?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it feels, specific to our time, but it really is a reformulation of old, sort of terrible heresies and ways that human beings have been tempted from all, ever since we were created, the fall in the garden. What I define it as being, and what I think it actually is a movement of atheism, utopian atheism, revolutionary movement. And I think the two things to really drill down into that it really fuel the revolution are the tribalism of identity politics. So reducing every person into a collective politicized identity and then making sacred certain identities. Yeah. And then the second fuel, I think, of the revolution is an ever-evolving sexual revolution that really has no limiting principle whatsoever. And so what happens, I think it's not merely a sexual revolution as we've used that phrase for decades. It is actually celebration of transgressive behavior. So the idea being that we are oppressed by groups outside of ourselves, so if we are in one group, then we're oppressed by these other groups and the system at large. Right. But our oppression is also from the moral law. And so part of our liberation is not just defeating other groups, it is planting a flag of transgressive behavior for the sake of defeating the moral law and the moral law's author. And so that's why you see this ever escalating kind of behavior, where you think it can't get more bizarre, and it does. At first it's, one thing about destabilizing marriage, right. Then it's transgenderism, then it's, furries, people, transspeciesm, because it's just, there's no way to limit it. It has to, what's normal today will be boring tomorrow. And so you have to keep pushing the boundaries.
But, I've always had this ideology, it can only go so far, right? Until people see the bad fruit of it. It's a great point. We redefined marriage. We just want the same rights as you. We want to be at the bedside of something that's dying. Love is love. Why can't we get along? Then what do we see after that? Well, it can lead to polygamy. You've got these polyamorous relationships. You see the transgender movement, as you point out now. You see furries. People are coming to class dressed up like a cat. Right? I mean, and the professor's got to acknowledge them. We live in this dictatorship of relativism where that truth is that person's truth. Mine's mine. You're saying we need to plant a flag. That sounds confrontational. It sounds like you're going to be looked like you are prejudiced. Who knows what kind of monikers going to be put on you. How do you see us doing that today? And have we become so shamed into silence that people really aren't speaking truth about what the true nature of gender is, or sexuality, or marriage, or things along those lines?
Yeah, no, I think that we have to have a nuanced approach. So I like to think of it as there are different categories of people who are pulled into the woke movement. Some are true victims. Their vulnerabilities, their wounds, their sufferings have been exploited, very manipulatively, and they've been pulled into this movement in ways that I don't see them having a ton of culpability. Maybe they're too young to understand what's happening and, all these things. And so I think that we really need to be leading with healing, love, that real charity-led approach. But then there's also aspects of the movement that are really doing sinister things that we just have to, maybe try to help those people who are spearheading it, but they also just need to be stopped in the immediate, there's an immediate need of stopping the damage, especially when it's targeting children. So I think we have to have sort of an agile approach as we think of it, and not become a mirror image of what the progressive movement really, the way they fight is by reducing other people into categories where they really lose their personhood, their humanity. And we don't want to do the opposite. We don't want to reduce people to their ideology and then fight the ideology by thinking that person's our enemy. Christ is interested in every soul. And so we need to treat every person in front of us with great love.
They take almost a militant approach sometimes, where we as Christians should really approach this with a spirit of love and with truth.
That's right. That's right. And I think that can be used against us because, compassion and love are at the heart of our, that one of the greatest ways that we are manipulated, I think, or the movement manipulates people is through an appeal to compassion. And I think it really actually mimics sort of a narcissism move. The way that narcissists operate, they look for somebody who's a real empath because they know they can exploit that. And I think, there's something, I'm not saying every woke person's a narcissist. I'm saying the movement operates in the same manipulative manner as a narcissist.
That's so funny. Rick's in Oak Brook, Illinois. And Rick, good afternoon. You're on the air with Noelle Mering.
Hi, yes. I've had a lot of negative experiences with wokeism. I left my old church because I felt I got too woke. But after 20 years in the labor movement, I've read Das Kapital. I've read the Communist Manifesto. I don't agree with everything Marx said. But Marxism is a movement towards state ownership of the means of production. That's what that is. Marx never mentions homosexuality. He didn't know what transgenderism was. His understanding of racism was about imperialism. It seems like the people who are opposed to wokeism, rather than making nuanced arguments, they're just reaching back to that Red Scare and using the Marxism boogeyman, and that's not going to work. We have to have good arguments against each and everything. But calling everything Marxism is unfair because I live in America. We have one of the most, let's be honest, we have one of the most unequal distributions of wealth in the industrialized world. And I don't hear anyone saying we need to have the state ownership of the shoe factory or the car factory. Indeed, those are all gone overseas.
Rick, thanks for your call. I'm going to let Noelle respond. I think she has your point there. Are we seeing the tentacles of Marxism in this? Are there vestiges of it?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the caller. You don't want to lazily call everything Marxism without deep thought, and that's certainly something to avoid. However, Marx was not purely talking about economics. He was really making a lot of anthropological claims, and he was first and foremost an atheist. That was rife throughout his writing. Also, Engels wrote about how the husband is the oppressor of the wife, in more or less words, that the wife is the proletariat and the husband is the bourgeois. So they were already questioning this present state of marriage and how it should be dismantled. So there were seeds of revolution that, he was mostly writing about a class revolution, but the people who were devotees of Marx that came after understood pretty quickly that the way to make it spread was to seed revolution in all the institutions throughout the West, and that the Western mindset was too authoritarian, too imbued with tradition, too respectful of the father, that all of these things were part of what makes the system, the superstructure, continue that Marx was decrying. And so his followers really quickly translated the revolution not just along class division, but along cultural divisions, race, male, female, the intellectual class. So it was brought in pretty directly after him. And, that's why we see many of the leaders, for example, of the Black Lives Matter movement said that they were devoted Marxists and that they were trained Marxists. Marx is celebrated and read. One of the most common books read in schools, education institutions read Paulo Freire, who is a Marxist. That it's a boogeyman only insofar as that's a way to make us not acknowledge the influence that he's had. But the influence is pretty traceable and trackable.
Dan's in Richmond, Virginia. He's a teacher. He's got an interesting story to share. Dan, good afternoon.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I really feel that sometimes these tools of wokeness can be turned on the system itself. If I were to have an 80-pound or 110-pound cat in my room, I would consider that a danger to the other students and to myself, and I would require a cage. And I would accept losing my job for that.
That's clever. I had not thought of it that way. But you're right. I just was talking to a woman today who in her kids' school, the teacher provided a litter box because one of the students identified as a furry or as a cat. So, this is...
Is that true?
Yes.
I thought that was a rumor.
I've heard that several times. And this woman had personal
They actually
experience.
got her a litter box.
They got her a litter box.
She identified
I don't know if she defecates in there, but...
They need to get her a therapist is what they need. Anyone
really
who thinks that they're an animal.
It's bizarre and it is so sad. I think we should be people who are not demoralized, discouraged. We know that God wants this culture transformed towards him, back towards him. We know Our Lady is advocating for that as well. So we should have all the hope and the confidence in the world that, the truth can withstand any scrutiny. The only thing we have to fear is God. If we lose our fear of God, we start to fear everything else. If we retain our fear of God, we will step out in courage and we can really change the culture for the good.
Check out Noelle's book, Awake, Not Woke. Also, Theology of Home, theologyofhome.com.
That's right.
It's her website. And share the podcast. It's well worth revisiting if you've missed any part of it. I'm Drew Mariani, out of time for the day. Remember, God loves you. And so do I. Have a great afternoon. Hey, like what you just heard? Then share it with your family and friends. And thanks for listening.